Have you ever wondered why Western civilization became the dominant force shaping our modern world? What if I told you that the secret lies not in military might or economic power, but in two fundamental principles that most people completely overlook? Today, we're diving deep into Charlie Kirk's provocative book, The Right Side of History, How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. And I guarantee this summary will challenge everything you think you know about civilization, progress, and what makes societies truly successful. Kirk makes a bold claim that will shock many viewers. Western civilization didn't rise to prominence through accident, exploitation, or luck. Instead, he argues that two specific intellectual foundations, reason rooted in ancient Greek philosophy and moral purpose derived from Judeo-Christian values, created an unprecedented combination that launched humanity into an era of unparalleled advancement. This isn't just another political commentary or historical overview. This is a battle cry for understanding why certain ideas created prosperity, while others led to stagnation and suffering. But here's where it gets controversial. Kirk doesn't just celebrate Western achievements, he warns that we're actively dismantling the very foundations that create our success. He argues that modern society is abandoning reason and moral purpose in favour of emotional reasoning and moral relativism, potentially destroying centuries of human progress. Whether you agree with Kirk's politics or not, his core argument about ideas having consequences demands serious consideration. Charlie Kirk's The Right Side of History emerges as a passionate defence of Western civilization during an era when such defences have become increasingly controversial. Published in 2021, this work represents Kirk's attempt to articulate why Western societies achieved unprecedented levels of human flourishing compared to other civilizations throughout history. Rather than attributing Western success to geographic advantages, natural resources, or military conquest, Kirk focuses on intellectual and moral foundations that he believes created the conditions for sustained progress. The book operates on multiple levels simultaneously. At its surface, it functions as a historical survey tracing the development of Western thought from ancient Greece through the Enlightenment to modern times. However, Kirk's deeper purpose involves diagnosing what he perceives as a contemporary crisis threatening the survival of Western values and institutions. He contends that modern intellectuals, politicians, and cultural leaders have lost sight of the philosophical principles that enabled Western societies to develop concepts like individual rights, scientific inquiry, economic freedom, and democratic governance. Kirk structures his argument around the premise that ideas have profound consequences for human societies. He rejects materialist explanations for Western dominance, instead emphasizing how specific ways of thinking about truth, morality, and human nature created the intellectual framework necessary for technological advancement, economic prosperity, and political liberty. This approach allows him to present Western civilization not as an accident of geography or resources, but as the logical outcome of adopting superior philosophical foundations. The author acknowledges that Western societies have committed serious historical wrongs, but he argues that the principles underlying Western civilization provide the tools necessary for recognizing and correcting these mistakes. This nuanced position allows Kirk to celebrate Western achievements while acknowledging past failures, presenting Western values as self-correcting rather than inherently flawed. Kirk's central thesis revolves around identifying two pillars that enabled Western civilization to achieve unprecedented human progress: reason and moral purpose. He traces the development of rational thinking to ancient Greek philosophers who pioneered logical inquiry, systematic observation, and the pursuit of objective truth. According to Kirk, Greek thinkers established the intellectual framework that would eventually enable scientific advancement, technological innovation, and evidence-based decision-making across all areas of human endeavour. The second pillar, moral purpose, derives from Judeo-Christian religious traditions that introduce revolutionary concepts about human dignity, individual worth, and universal moral principles. Kirk argues that these religious foundations provided Western societies with a moral compass that prevented pure rationalism from devolving into nihilism or utilitarian calculations that devalue human life. The combination of reason and moral purpose created what Kirk describes as a unique synthesis, enabling both material progress and ethical advancement. Kirk contrasts this Western synthesis with alternative civilizational approaches that he claims produced inferior outcomes. He argues that societies emphasizing reason without moral grounding, such as certain Enlightenment philosophies, eventually led to destructive ideologies like communism and fascism. Conversely, societies emphasizing moral purpose without rational inquiry became stagnant and unable to adapt to changing circumstances. Only the Western combination of both elements, Kirk contends, produce sustained human flourishing. The book's contemporary focus involves Kirk's warning that modern Western societies are abandoning these foundational principles. He argues that universities, media institutions, and political movements increasingly reject objective truth in favour of subjective experience, while simultaneously abandoning moral absolutes for relativistic ethics. This dual abandonment, according to Kirk, threatens to undermine the philosophical foundations that enabled Western success, potentially leading to civilizational decline and the loss of hard-won human progress. Kirk begins his historical analysis with ancient Greece, arguing that Greek philosophers revolutionized human thinking by introducing systematic rational inquiry. He emphasizes how figures like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle developed methodologies for pursuing truth through logical reasoning rather than relying solely on tradition, authority, or emotional intuition. This intellectual revolution, according to Kirk, established the foundation for all subsequent Western achievements in science, philosophy, and governance. Greek rationalism created the conceptual tools necessary for questioning assumptions, testing hypotheses, and building knowledge through evidence and argument rather than mere assertion. The author then examines the emergence of Judeo-Christian moral frameworks, arguing that these religious traditions introduced unprecedented concepts about human dignity and universal moral principles. Kirk contends that Judaism and Christianity taught that all humans possess inherent worth regardless of social status, ethnicity, or personal characteristics. This moral revolution, he argues, provided the ethical foundation for later developments like individual rights, abolition movements, and democratic governance. Without these moral insights, Kirk suggests, rational inquiry alone would have lacked the ethical framework necessary to protect human dignity during periods of social and technological change. Kirk dedicates significant attention to the medieval period, challenging common narratives that portray this era as intellectually stagnant. He argues that medieval thinkers successfully integrated Greek rationalism with Christian moral philosophy, creating sophisticated theological and philosophical systems that preserved and advanced both traditions. Medieval universities, according to Kirk, institutionalized the pursuit of knowledge while maintaining commitment to moral truth, creating the educational framework that would eventually enable Renaissance and Enlightenment achievements. The Renaissance and Enlightenment receive extensive treatment as Kirk traces how Western thinkers applied reason and moral purpose to revolutionize human understanding of natural phenomena, political organization, and individual rights. He argues that scientific revolution, figures like Galileo and Newton, succeeded because they combined rigorous rational methodology with moral conviction about the importance of truth. Similarly, political philosophers like John Locke developed theories of individual rights and limited government by applying both rational analysis and moral principles about human dignity and freedom. Kirk examines the development of economic systems, arguing that free market capitalism emerged from the Western synthesis of reason and moral purpose. He contends that rational analysis demonstrated the efficiency of market mechanisms for allocating resources and incentivizing innovation, while moral principles provided the ethical framework necessary to protect individual property rights and voluntary exchange. This combination, according to Kirk, enabled Western societies to generate unprecedented wealth while maintaining commitment to individual liberty and human dignity. The author addresses Western historical failures, particularly slavery and colonialism, arguing that these practices violated the fundamental principles of Western civilization rather than representing their logical outcome. He contends that abolition movements succeeded precisely because they appealed to Western commitments to reason and moral purpose, demonstrating how Western values contain the intellectual resources necessary for self-correction. This argument allows Kirk to acknowledge historical wrongs while maintaining that Western principles provide the tools for recognizing and correcting such failures. Kirk's analysis of modern threats focuses on what he perceives as intellectual movements that reject either reason or moral purpose in favor of alternative approaches to truth and ethics. He argues that postmodern philosophy undermines rational inquiry by claiming that objective truth is impossible or irrelevant, while moral relativism abandons universal ethical principles in favor of situational or cultural standards. These developments, according to Kirk, threaten to destroy the philosophical foundations that enabled Western achievements, potentially leading to intellectual and moral chaos. The book concludes with Kirk's prescription for preserving Western civilization through renewed commitment to reason and moral purpose. He argues that educational institutions, political leaders, and cultural influencers must actively defend and promote these foundational principles against contemporary challenges. This requires both intellectual engagement with philosophical questions about truth and morality and practical commitment to applying these principles in contemporary debates about politics, economics, and social organisation. The first crucial takeaway involves understanding that civilizational success depends primarily on ideas rather than material advantages. Kirk demonstrates that Western achievements in science, technology, politics, and economics emerge from specific ways of thinking about truth, morality, and human nature rather than geographic, luck, or natural resource abundance. This insight suggests that preserving and advancing human progress requires ongoing attention to philosophical foundations rather than simply focusing on practical or technical solutions to contemporary problems. Rational inquiry emerges as an indispensable tool for human progress, but only when properly understood and applied. Kirk argues that genuine rationalism involves systematic pursuit of objective truth through evidence, logic, and careful reasoning rather than mere intellectual sophistication or academic credentialism. This distinction becomes crucial for evaluating contemporary intellectual movements that may appear rational while actually undermining genuine rational inquiry through ideological assumptions or methodological biases. Moral purpose provides the ethical framework necessary to direct rational inquiry toward beneficial outcomes for human flourishing. Kirk contends that pure rationalism without moral grounding can lead to destructive conclusions that treat human beings as mere means to ends rather than inherently valuable individuals. This insight suggests that educational and cultural institutions must cultivate both intellectual rigour and moral wisdom to produce leaders capable of making decisions that serve genuine human good. The integration of reason and moral purpose requires ongoing effort and cannot be taken for granted across generations. Kirk warns that each generation must actively learn, defend, and apply these principles rather than assuming they will automatically persist through cultural inheritance. This takeaway emphasises the importance of educational institutions, family structures, and cultural traditions that consciously transmit both intellectual and moral foundations to future generations. Historical failures of Western societies result from violations of foundational principles rather than logical applications of them. Kirk argues that understanding this distinction enables both honest acknowledgement of past wrongs and confident defence of underlying values that made correction possible. This perspective suggests that criticism of historical failures should strengthen rather than undermine commitment to reason and moral purpose when properly understood and applied. Contemporary intellectual movements that reject objective truth pose existential threats to the foundations of human progress. Kirk contends that postmodern philosophy, moral relativism, and ideological thinking undermine the intellectual tools necessary for solving problems, making moral judgments, and building knowledge. This takeaway suggests that defending Western civilization requires active intellectual engagement with philosophical questions about truth, morality, and human nature rather than merely political or cultural resistance. Educational institutions bear primary responsibility for transmitting the intellectual and moral foundations necessary for civilizational continuity. Kirk argues that universities, schools, and other educational organisations must prioritise teaching students how to think rationally and morally rather than simply transmitting information or promoting particular political viewpoints. This insight emphasises the crucial role of educational reform in preserving and advancing human progress. Economic freedom emerges naturally from the combination of rational analysis and moral principle when properly applied to questions about resource allocation and human cooperation. Kirk argues that free market systems succeed because they align individual incentives with collective benefit while respecting human dignity and voluntary choice. This takeaway suggests that economic policy debates should focus on philosophical foundations rather than merely technical considerations about efficiency or distribution. Political liberty requires both rational understanding of human nature and moral commitment to individual dignity and rights. Kirk contends that democratic governance succeeded in Western societies because it reflected realistic assessments of human capabilities and limitations combined with ethical principles about the proper relationship between individuals and government. This insight suggests that preserving democratic institutions requires ongoing attention to both empirical understanding of political dynamics and moral principles about legitimate authority. Cultural institutions play essential roles in maintaining the intellectual and moral foundations necessary for sustained human progress. Kirk argues that families, religious communities, civic organisations, and media institutions must actively promote reason and moral purpose through their teachings, practices, and public influence. This final takeaway emphasises that preserving Western civilization requires broad social commitment rather than merely political or educational efforts. Charlie Kirk's The Right Side of History presents a provocative thesis about the philosophical foundations of human progress that deserves serious engagement regardless of one's political perspectives. His central argument that reason and moral purpose created the conditions for unprecedented Western achievements offers a framework for understanding both historical developments and contemporary challenges. While readers may disagree with specific interpretations or applications, Kirk's emphasis on the fundamental importance of ideas for civilizational outcomes provides valuable insights into the intellectual and moral resources necessary for sustained human flourishing. The book's greatest strength lies in its integration of historical analysis with contemporary diagnosis, demonstrating how philosophical principles developed over centuries continue to influence current debates about education, politics, economics, and culture. Kirk's ability to trace connections between ancient Greek rationalism, Judeo-Christian ethics, and modern Western institutions provides readers with a comprehensive perspective on how ideas shape societies across extended periods. This long-term perspective offers essential context for evaluating contemporary intellectual and cultural movements. Kirk's warnings about the abandonment of reason and moral purpose deserve careful consideration even by those who reject his political conclusions. His argument that objective truth and universal moral principles provide indispensable tools for human progress raises important questions about the consequences of relativistic approaches to knowledge and ethics. Whether one agrees with Kirk's specific solutions, his identification of potential threats to the intellectual foundations of modern civilization demands thoughtful response from anyone concerned about preserving and advancing human achievement across future generations.